Ethan Harper, a reclusive former soldier living in the Montana wilderness, discovers a malnourished Labrador named Shadow and her 2 pups during a brutal snowstorm. As Ethan nurses them back to health, a dangerous man named Travis arrives, claiming Shadow as his property. Ethan uncovers that Shadow escaped a cruel past tied to illegal breeding rings, with Travis and his men threatening their safety. Ethan protects Shadow and her pups in a tense confrontation, using his military skills to ensure their survival. Over time, Shadow learns to trust Ethan, and together they build a new life filled with purpose and healing. In the end, Ethan finds hope, companionship, and the courage to fight for justice. What do you think about this story of courage, second chances, and the transformative power of love? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to DG Story for more heartwarming and thrilling tales like this one. The wind howled through the snow-covered pines, its chilling echoes carrying across the vast expanse of the Montana mountains. Inside a small wooden cabin tucked away at the edge of the forest, Ethan Harper sat silently by the fireplace, his eyes distant as he watched the flames dance. This was how he survived the brutal winters, in solitude and silence. 40. Ethan had lived through more than he ever thought possible. 3 years earlier, he had lost his wife and young daughter in a car accident. The grief had driven him away from the bustling town he once called home, leading him to seek refuge in the mountains, where no one could invade his world. Ethan was a former soldier, a man who had faced danger countless times. But the pain of loss had turned him into someone different, withdrawn, weary, and stripped of purpose. His cabin was modest but warm, with 1 bedroom, a simple kitchen, and a small living room where he spent most of his time. A worn bookshelf stood against one wall, filled with survival manuals, military history books, and a few novels he barely touched anymore. A rifle hung above the mantel, a relic of his past that he rarely used except for the occasional hunting trip to keep his pantry stocked. The winters in Montana were unforgiving, and this one was no exception. Snowstorms raged frequently, blanketing the landscape in endless white. Ethan had grown accustomed to the isolation, though there were moments when the silence felt heavier than usual. He sometimes thought he heard faint noises from the forest, a rustling in the bushes, a distant snap of a branch, but he always dismissed them as animals moving through the wilderness. That evening, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Ethan sipped his black coffee, the bitter warmth offering little comfort. He stared at the framed photograph on the mantel, the only reminder of the life he had lost. It was a picture of his wife, Claire, and their daughter, Emily, their smiles frozen in time. Ethan's jaw tightened as he reached out to straighten the frame, his fingers lingering on the edge. Suddenly, a loud thud interrupted the quiet, followed by a faint scratching sound. Ethan froze, his eyes darting to the door. It wasn't unusual for the wind to knock things around, but this sound was different, deliberate. He set his mug down and rose to his feet, his body tensing out of habit. The scratching came again, followed by a low whimper. His brows furrowed as he moved cautiously toward the door, grabbing the rifle from the mantel. He peered through the frosted window. First, he saw nothing but the swirling snow. Then, just outside the door, a dark shape came into focus. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, unlocking the door and pulling it open. The icy wind rushed in, biting at his face and filling the cabin with its harsh chill. Standing there, half buried in the snow, was a black Labrador. Her body trembled violently, her ribs visible beneath her matted fur. Pressed against her side were 2 tiny puppies, their small bodies shivering as they clung to her for warmth. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The dog lifted her head, her amber eyes locking onto his with a mix of desperation and fear. Frost clung to her muzzle, and her breaths came in labored puffs of vapor. "Jesus," Ethan whispered. He glanced down at the pups, their fragile forms barely visible against the white backdrop. For a moment, he hesitated, Taking them in would mean trouble, more mouths to feed, more responsibilities. But as the dog whimpered softly, nudging one of the pups closer to her, something inside him stirred. Without thinking, Ethan stepped aside. "Come on," he said, his voice gruff. "Get in here before you freeze to death." The Labrador didn't move at first, her paws rooted in the snow. Ethan crouched down, softening his tone. "It's okay, girl. You're safe here." After a moment of hesitation, she nudged the pups toward the door. One by one, when the smaller pup stumbled, she gently picked it up by the scruff of its neck and carried it inside. Ethan closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm. The sudden warmth of the cabin made the dog shiver more violently as her body adjusted to the change in temperature. Ethan grabbed an old blanket from the couch and draped it over her and the pups. She flinched at first but didn't growl or snap. Instead, she let out a shaky sigh and lay down near the fireplace, curling protectively around her pups. Ethan stood over them, his mind racing. He had no idea where they had come from or how they had survived this long in the storm. But one thing was clear: they wouldn't have lasted much longer out there. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he murmured, crouching down to get a better look at the mother and her pups. She watched him warily, her body tense, but there was no malice in her gaze. Ethan sighed and leaned back on his heels. "Well," he said, almost to himself, "looks like we're stuck with each other now." For the first time in what felt like years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The storm raged outside, howling like a restless beast as Ethan stood in his small cabin, staring at the unexpected guests now lying near his fireplace. The Labrador, whom he instinctively called Shadow, was curled protectively around her two pups, her eyes never leaving him. Despite the warmth of the fire, her body trembled slightly, a mix of exhaustion and the lingering cold. Ethan crouched down to their level, careful not to get too close. Shadow's gaze was sharp and cautious, her instincts clearly tuned to protect her young. The two pups, barely larger than his hands, were huddled against her, their tiny bodies twitching occasionally in their restless sleep. "You're tougher than you look," Ethan muttered, half to himself. He reached for an old bowl from the kitchen and filled it with lukewarm water. Placing it a few feet away from her, he stepped back. Shadow's nose twitched, and after a few hesitant moments, she stretched her neck forward to sniff the bowl. "Go on," Ethan encouraged quietly. "It's not poison." Shadow licked at the water tentatively before drinking in slow, deliberate gulps. Ethan watched, his arms crossed as he leaned against the counter. He wasn't sure what to make of the situation. Stray animals weren't uncommon in the wilderness, but the fact that she had survived the storm with two pups in tow was nothing short of a miracle. As the minutes passed, Shadow began to relax, though her watchful eyes never entirely softened. Ethan noted the thinness of her frame, the way her ribs jutted out under her dark fur. She'd been starving, maybe for weeks. Her pups didn't look much better, their small movements weak and sluggish. "You've been through hell," he said softly, shaking his head. "But you made it." Ethan sighed and walked back to the kitchen, rummaging through his supplies. He didn't have much, a few cans of soup, some dried meat, and a loaf of bread that was nearing the end of its shelf life. He tore off a small piece of jerky, softened it with a bit of water, and placed it on a plate. "Here," he said, sliding it closer to Shadow. "Not exactly gourmet, but it'll do." She eyed him suspiciously but didn't growl. After a moment, she sniffed the jerky and took a cautious bite. Ethan couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction as she began to eat more steadily. As the hours passed, the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Ethan added another log to the fire, glancing occasionally at Shadow and her pups. The cabin, normally quiet and lifeless, felt oddly different with them there. "You're probably wondering what kind of idiot I am for letting you in," he said aloud, as if she could understand him. "Truth is, I don't even know why I did it." Shadow didn't respond, of course, but her steady gaze felt almost like acknowledgement. Ethan pulled up a chair near the fire and sat down, the warmth easing some of the tension in his shoulders. The sound of the wind outside had always been a source of comfort to him, a reminder of the isolation he'd chosen. But tonight felt less like solitude and more like loneliness. "You've probably had a rougher life than I have," he mused, his voice low, "but I'm guessing you're still fighting for something." Shadow shifted slightly, curling tighter around her pups. One of them let out a small, squeaky whimper, prompting her to nuzzle it gently with her nose. Ethan watched, a strange mixture of admiration and sadness stirring within him. He had seen resilience before in soldiers, in civilians during the chaos of war. But this was different. This was pure instinct, a mother's will to protect her young no matter the cost. By the next morning, the storm had calmed, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow that sparkled in the weak sunlight. Ethan woke to the sound of soft whimpering and the crackling fire that had burned low overnight. Shadow was awake, too, her head resting on her paws as she watched him with that same cautious intensity. The pups squirmed beside her, their tiny legs kicking as they nuzzled closer to her warmth. "Morning," Ethan said groggily, stretching. He walked to the window and peeked outside. The world was a sea of white, the trees heavy with snow. He sighed. Clearing a path to the main road would take hours, maybe even a full day. Turning back to the animals, he noticed Shadow's ears perk up slightly as he moved. She wasn't growling or baring her teeth, but she remained guarded. Ethan grabbed a can of chicken soup and heated it on the stove. When it was warm, he poured a small amount into a bowl and set it near Shadow. "Not exactly filet mignon, but it's better than nothing," he said, stepping back. Shadow sniffed the air, her body still tense. After a moment, she leaned forward and lapped at the soup, her movements deliberate and wary. Ethan smiled faintly, watching her eat. "You're a survivor, that's for sure," he murmured. "But where the hell did you come from?" As the day wore on, Ethan found himself thinking more and more about Shadow's past. The scar on her neck suggested she hadn't been astray for long. Someone had owned her, and not kindly. He felt a pang of anger at the thought, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of responsibility. "You're safe now," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Shadow's amber eyes met his for a fleeting moment before she lowered her head, nuzzling one of her pups. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a glimmer of purpose. The days passed slowly, the Montana winter gripping the mountains with its relentless cold. Ethan's cabin, normally a place of stillness and solitude, had transformed into something else entirely. The quiet was now broken by the occasional yip of the pups or the soft shuffle of paws against the wooden floor. Shadow, the black Labrador, remained ever watchful, her eyes tracking Ethan's every move as he moved around the cabin. Ethan had grown used to her presence, though she was still far from trusting him fully. She tolerated his proximity but kept her distance whenever he got too close to her pups. Her protective instincts were sharp, honed by whatever hardships she'd endured before arriving at his doorstep. "She's a good mom," Ethan muttered to himself one afternoon as he stood by the stove, warming up a pot of stew. Shadow lay near the fireplace, her body curled around the pups. Blizzard, the larger of the two, was trying to climb over his sibling, Cole, who protested with a high-pitched whine. Shadow nuzzled them both, settling them back down. Ethan chuckled softly. "Looks like you've got your hands full," though she was still wary. Shadow had started showing signs of trust. She no longer growled when Ethan approached with food or water, and she allowed him to sit closer by the fire. Once, while she was eating, he reached out to move her bowl slightly. Shadow froze, her body tensing, but she didn't growl. It was a small victory, but Ethan took it as progress. "You're coming around," he said one evening, sitting on the floor a few feet away from her. Slowly but surely, Shadow glanced at him, her amber eyes unreadable, before lowering her head to rest on her paws. The pups, meanwhile, had begun to explore the cabin in their clumsy, unsteady way, Blizzard was the bolder of the two, constantly waddling off to inspect a corner or sniff at Ethan's boots. Cole, smaller and quieter, usually stayed close to Shadow. Watching them brought an odd sense of warmth to Ethan's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. One night, as the wind howled outside, Ethan sat by the fireplace with a mug of coffee in hand. Shadow was lying nearby, her head resting on her paws. The pups were nestled against her side, fast asleep. The soft glow of the fire painted the cabin in warm, flickering light, casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan sipped his coffee, his thoughts drifting. "You remind me of someone," he said softly, his eyes on Shadow. Her ears twitched, but she didn't lift her head. "My wife, Claire," Ethan continued, his voice low. "She was a fighter too, stubborn as hell, always looking out for everyone else." He stared into the fire, his grip tightening on the mug. "We lost her, and Emily, 3 years ago. Car accident. A drunk driver." The words hung heavy in the air. It wasn't something he talked about, not even to himself. But saying it aloud, even to a dog, felt strangely cathartic. "I didn't think I'd find a reason to care about anything again," he admitted. "Didn't think I wanted to." Shadow lifted her head slightly, her amber eyes meeting his. For a moment, Ethan felt as though she understood him, as though she recognized the weight of his pain. The next morning, Ethan decided to test how much trust they'd built. After clearing the snow from his front porch, he returned inside and approached Shadow with a soft voice. "Let's see how you handle this," he said, holding out a leash he'd found in the back of his closet. Shadow's ears flattened, and she let out a low whine, her body stiffening. "It's okay," Ethan reassured her, kneeling a few feet away. "I'm not going to hurt you." He placed the leash on the floor and stepped back, giving her space. Shadow sniffed at it cautiously, her nose twitching. "We're not going far," Ethan said. "Just outside for a bit. The pups can stay warm in here." After several minutes of coaxing, Shadow allowed Ethan to clip the leash to the makeshift collar she wore. He opened the door, the cold air rushing in, and stepped outside with her. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they walked a short distance from the cabin. Shadow stayed close to him, her body tense, but she didn't resist. Her eyes darted around, scanning the trees as though she expected something or someone to emerge from the shadows. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Ethan murmured, glancing down at her. "Don't worry, you're safe now." Shadow didn't respond, of course, but she seemed to relax slightly, her ears perking up as she sniffed at the snow. For the first time since she arrived, Ethan felt a small flicker of hope. Shadow was learning to trust him, little by little, and in turn, he was starting to feel something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. As they returned to the cabin, the pups greeted them with tiny yips of excitement. Shadow immediately went to them, licking their faces and nuzzling them close. Ethan watched from the doorway, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're tougher than you look," he said softly. "All of you are." That night, as the fire crackled and the pups tumbled over each other near the hearth, Ethan sat back in his chair, a strange sense of peace settling over him. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's past wasn't done with her yet. The snow had finally stopped falling, leaving the Montana wilderness blanketed in a pristine, blinding white. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. Inside the cabin, Ethan chopped wood near the fireplace, the rhythmic sound of the axe splitting logs filling the room. Shadow was lying by the fire, her pups nestled against her. The peace was deceptive. Ethan couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him in the past few days. Shadow was still cautious, her ears perking up at the slightest sound outside. It wasn't just her usual vigilance. There was something deeper, something almost instinctive. Then, one afternoon, the quiet shattered. Ethan had just stepped out to gather more firewood when he noticed the footprints. They were fresh, human, and leading straight toward his cabin. His heart sank as he crouched down to examine them. The tracks were wide and heavy, made by boots someone had been here recently, and they hadn't bothered to hide their presence. He looked around, scanning the tree line for movement, but the forest was still. Ethan grabbed the axe he'd been using and carried it back inside, his pulse quickening. Shadow immediately sensed his tension, her ears standing at attention. She rose to her feet, standing protectively in front of her pups. "Easy, girl," Ethan murmured, setting the axe by the door. He grabbed his rifle from above the mantel and checked the chamber. The knock came a few moments later. It was firm, deliberate. Ethan's stomach tightened as he approached the door. Peering through the frosted window, he saw a man standing on the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a heavy coat. His face was shadowed by a hood, but Ethan could make out a smirk as the man raised a hand to knock again. Ethan opened the door just a crack, keeping the rifle out of sight but ready. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady. The man looked him over, his smirk widening. "Yeah, I think you can. Name's Travis. I'm here for my dog." Ethan's grip on the door tightened. "Your dog?" Travis nodded toward the cabin. "Black lab, name's Shadow. She got out a while back. Been looking for her ever since." Ethan didn't move. "If she's yours, how'd she end up half-starved with 2 pups in the middle of a storm?" Travis's smirk faltered for a moment before returning. "Things happen, but she's mine, so I'll just take her and be on my way." Shadow appeared in the doorway then, her body tense, her lips pulling back in a low growl. Travis's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, and something in his expression shifted from confidence to irritation. "She doesn't seem too happy to see you," Ethan said, stepping slightly in front of her. Travis shrugged. "Dogs don't always know what's best for them. You're lucky she didn't tear up your place." Ethan's jaw tightened. He could see the scar on Shadow's neck, the way she had flinched when he first tried to touch her. This man wasn't her owner, he was her captor. "She's not going anywhere," Ethan said firmly. Travis's smirk disappeared entirely. "Look, old man, I'm not looking to start trouble. Just give me the dog, and I'll leave. And I'm not looking to give you anything." Ethan shot back. "Now get off my property." For a moment, the 2 men stared each other down. Shadow growled low in her throat, the sound vibrating through the cabin. Travis took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "All right," he said, his voice colder now. "I'll go, but don't think this is over." He turned and walked away, his boots crunching in the snow. Ethan waited until Travis disappeared into the tree line before closing the door and locking it. Inside, Shadow paced near the window, her body still coiled with tension. Ethan watched her, his mind racing. Whoever this Travis was, he wasn't going to give up easily. And if Shadow's reaction was anything to go by, he was dangerous. "You know him, don't you?" Ethan asked softly, crouching down near her. Shadow stopped pacing and looked at him, her amber eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't quite name, fear, maybe, or recognition. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Looks like we've got a problem, girl." That night, Ethan double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. He kept his rifle loaded and within reach, glancing toward the tree line every now and then. Shadow stayed close to her pups, her ears twitching at every sound. Ethan didn't sleep much. He sat by the fire, the rifle resting against his chair, his thoughts churning. Who was Travis? And what kind of life had Shadow endured before finding her way to his door? The storm might have passed, but Ethan had the sinking feeling that the real trouble was just beginning. The next morning, Ethan woke early, his mind still heavy from the encounter with Travis. The sky outside was overcast, the sun struggling to pierce through the thick layer of clouds. Shadow sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the tree line as though expecting Travis to reappear at any moment. Ethan stood silently for a moment, watching her. He could feel her unease, her tension radiating across the room. The pups, blissfully unaware, tumbled around on the floor, their tiny yips breaking the stillness. "You're still on edge," Ethan muttered, grabbing his coat. "Can't blame you. I don't trust that guy either." Ethan decided it was time to get some answers, loading Shadow and the pups into the back of his old truck. He set off for the nearest town, about an hour's drive away. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, her ears perked and her eyes scanning the passing landscape. Blizzard and Cole snuggled together in a blanket-lined crate on the floor. The town was small, a cluster of buildings nestled in the valley, surrounded by snowy peaks. Ethan parked outside the local veterinary clinic, a modest building with a faded sign that read Dr. Lee Veterinarian. Inside, the warmth of the clinic was a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside. A young receptionist greeted Ethan with a polite smile, but her expression quickly softened into concern when she saw Shadow's thin frame and the small, frail pups. "What can we do for you?" she asked. Ethan explained how Shadow and her pups had shown up at his door, emphasizing her condition and his concerns about her past. Dr. Lee, a kind-eyed woman in her 50s, joined them shortly after. She examined Shadow carefully, noting the scar around her neck and her malnourished state. "She's been through a lot," Dr. Lee said, her tone gentle but serious. "That scar, it looks like she was chained up for a long time. And these pups are young, maybe just a few weeks old. It's a miracle she kept them alive in this weather." Ethan nodded grimly. "I need to know if she belongs to anyone, if she has a chip or anything." Dr. Lee checked for a microchip, her brow furrowing as she worked. "There's no chip, but..." She hesitated, then looked up at Ethan. "There's evidence that she might have had one removed. It's not uncommon in cases of animal abuse or illegal breeding operations." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're saying someone might have dumped her because she wasn't useful anymore?" Dr. Lee nodded sadly. "Unfortunately, it happens more often than you'd think. Dogs like her, strong, protective, are often used for breeding or guarding. But when they're no longer useful, they're abandoned." As Ethan absorbed the information, Shadow watched him warily, her amber eyes flicking between him and Dr. Lee. She seemed to sense the gravity of the conversation, her body tense as though bracing for something. Dr. Lee offered to keep Shadow and the pups at the clinic for a full examination, but Ethan shook his head. "She stays with me," he said firmly. "She's been through enough." Before leaving, Dr. Lee gave Ethan a packet of nutritional supplements for Shadow and a gentle reminder to report any suspicious activity involving animals in the area. Back in the truck, Ethan sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Shadow lay on the passenger seat, her body curled protectively around Blizzard and Cole, who had begun to stir in their crate. "We're not done yet," Ethan muttered, starting the engine. On the way back to the cabin, Ethan stopped at the local sheriff's office. Inside, he met Sheriff Halford, a grizzled man with a no-nonsense demeanor who had been keeping order in the small town for decades. Ethan explained the situation, including his encounter with Travis. Halford listened carefully, leaning back in his chair as he chewed on the end of a toothpick. "Travis? Ha!" he said finally. "Name sounds familiar. Could be tied to some of the illegal breeding rings we've been trying to shut down. Nasty business." Ethan frowned. "So he's been on your radar before?" "Maybe," Halford said, shrugging. "Problem is, these operations are hard to pin down. They move around a lot, use middlemen to do their dirty work. Even when we do catch someone, proving abuse or trafficking isn't easy." Ethan's frustration grew. "So what am I supposed to do if he comes back?" Halford's expression hardened. "If he shows up on your property again, call us. But in the meantime, keep an eye out. These guys don't like to let go of what they think belongs to them." The drive back to the cabin was quiet, the weight of everything Ethan had learned settling heavily on his shoulders. Shadow rested her head on the edge of the seat, her eyes half closed but still alert. "You've been through hell," Ethan murmured, glancing at her. "But you're not going back to it. Not while I'm here." As the cabin came into view, Ethan felt a renewed sense of determination. Travis had underestimated him, and whoever else might come looking for Shadow would do the same. But Ethan wasn't about to let them take away the fragile sense of safety and trust they had begun to build. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Ethan sat on the floor near Shadow and her pups. Blizzard and Cole were wriggling around playfully, their tiny tails wagging as they explored their surroundings. Shadow watched them intently, her ears twitching at every sound. Ethan reached out cautiously, his hand hovering just above her head. She didn't flinch this time, didn't growl or pull away. Slowly, he let his fingers brush against her fur. "You're safe now," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I promise." Shadow leaned into his touch, just slightly, but it was enough. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet. The forest around the cabin was blanketed in snow, its usual sounds muffled by the winter chill. But inside, Ethan's mind churned with every possibility of what might come next. Travis's words echoed in his head, his vague threat lingering like a shadow over the peace he'd tried to build with Shadow and her pups. Shadow seemed to sense it too. She was restless, pacing near the windows and occasionally letting out low growls at the slightest noise outside. The pups, oblivious to the tension, played near the fireplace, their yips a comforting contrast to the unease that hung in the air. Ethan double-checked the cabin's locks, his rifle loaded and within reach. He wasn't a man who sought conflict, but his years as a soldier had taught him to be prepared for it. "You'll be fine," he murmured to Shadow one evening as he stroked her head. "If he comes back, we'll handle it." But when the confrontation came, it wasn't as simple as Ethan had hoped. It was late at night, the moon casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered forest. Ethan was dozing in his chair by the fire when a sharp knock jolted him awake. He sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the wall. Shadow, already on edge, bolted to the door, her body rigid and her growl low but menacing. The pups stirred at the sudden noise, huddling closer to the warmth of the fire. Ethan approached the door cautiously, peering through the window. His heart sank as he saw not just Travis, but two other men standing with him, their breath visible in the cold air. One of them carried a thick rope, the other a heavy flashlight. Ethan opened the door a crack, enough to see them clearly but not enough to let them in. "What the hell do you want?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through him. Travis smirked, his hands tucked casually into his coat pockets. "I told you this wasn't over. Came to get what's mine." "She's not yours," Ethan snapped. "Not anymore." The man with the rope stepped forward, his expression dark. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be, old man." Shadow's growl deepened. Her body pressed against the door as if she were ready to lunge at them. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle. "You step 1 foot inside, and it won't end well for you." Travis raised his hands mockingly. "Easy there, soldier. No need for violence. We're just here for the dog." "Like hell you are," Ethan shot back. "She's not going anywhere with you." The tension crackled in the freezing air. Travis's smirk faded, replaced by a harder edge. "Fine," he said coldly. "Have it your way." The first man moved toward the door, but Ethan was faster. He raised the rifle and aimed it squarely at the man's chest. "Don't," Ethan warned, his voice low and dangerous. The man hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. Travis stepped back slightly, clearly reevaluating the situation. But before anyone could act, Shadow lunged. She burst through the door, teeth bared, her growl turning into a feral snarl. The men stumbled back in surprise as Shadow leaped at the man with the rope, knocking him off balance. "Shadow!" Ethan shouted, stepping outside to back her up. The second man swung the flashlight, narrowly missing her as she darted out of the way. Ethan leveled his rifle at him, forcing him to freeze. "Enough!" Ethan barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Leave now." or I swear I'll put you all down myself." Travis, now pale and shaken, raised his hands again. All right, we're leaving." He gestured to his companions, who scrambled to their feet. Shadow stood her ground, her teeth bared and her growl rumbling like thunder. "We'll be back," Travis hissed as they retreated into the woods. "You're making a mistake, old man." Ethan didn't lower his rifle until their footsteps faded into the distance. Only then did he turn to Shadow, who was still tense, her eyes fixed on the tree line. "Good girl," Ethan said softly, crouching down to stroke her head. She leaned into his touch, her body relaxing slightly. Back inside the cabin, Ethan bolted the door and drew the curtains shut. Shadow lay near the fire, her pups cuddling against her as she licked their heads reassuringly. Ethan sat down heavily in his chair, the rifle resting against his knee. The weight of what had just happened settled over him. This wasn't over. Travis and his men would be back. And next time, they might not come unarmed. But as Ethan looked at Shadow, her amber eyes meeting his with an unspoken gratitude, he felt a surge of determination. "They won't take you," he said firmly. "Not you, not your pups. You're safe here." Shadow let out a soft whine, pressing her head against his leg. Ethan stayed up the rest of the night, watching over them as the fire crackled in the hearth. He knew the battle wasn't over, but for now, they had won. The morning after the confrontation, Ethan woke to a dull ache in his back from spending the night in his chair. The fire had burned low, and the cold seeped into the cabin. But the sight of Shadow and her pups lying peacefully near the hearth brought a momentary sense of calm. The events of the previous night played on repeat in Ethan's mind. Travis's words lingered like a bad taste, his threat promising more trouble to come. Ethan knew he couldn't wait for it to escalate. He had to act first. After feeding Shadow and ensuring the pups were warm and secure, Ethan loaded them into his truck. Shadow jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation, her body tense but her trust in Ethan clear. The pups, wrapped snugly in a blanket-lined crate, dozed quietly as the truck rumbled down the icy road. Ethan headed straight to the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Halford looked up from his desk, his brows knitting together at Ethan's grim expression. "What brings you in, Harper?" Halford asked, setting aside his coffee. Ethan wasted no time recounting the events of the previous night, describing the confrontation with Travis and his two accomplices. Halford listened intently, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "This Travis character, he's been causing us headaches for years," he said finally. "We've suspected him of being tied to illegal breeding and animal abuse rings, but we've never had enough to pin him down." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "He's not going to stop, Halford. He thinks Shadow is his property, and he's willing to fight for her. He didn't even try to hide it." Halford nodded slowly. "If he's willing to show up at your door with backup, that means he feels entitled to her, and that makes him dangerous." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Then we need to do something. Shadow and her pups aren't safe as long as he's out there." Halford called in his deputy, a younger officer named Carter, to take a detailed statement from Ethan. They also photographed Shadow's scarred neck, using it as evidence of her abuse. "We'll keep a patrol car near your property for the next few nights," Halford assured him. "If Travis shows up again, we'll have him." But Ethan wasn't satisfied. "What about the bigger picture?" he pressed. "If Travis is part of an operation, taking him down won't stop the rest of it." Halford sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're aware. We've been trying to track these groups for years, but they're slippery. They use abandoned farms, move their dogs frequently, and avoid keeping any records without solid proof. It's like chasing shadows." Ethan's gaze hardened. "Then I'll get you proof." Halford's eyes narrowed. "Don't do anything reckless, Harper. Leave this to us." Ethan didn't respond, but the fire in his eyes made it clear he had no intention of sitting idly by. Back at the cabin, Ethan began piecing together a plan. If Travis was part of a larger network, there had to be a trail, something he could follow. He started by searching online, digging into reports of animal abuse cases in the region. The more he read, the angrier he became. Stories of neglect, overbreeding, and cruelty painted a bleak picture, and many of the descriptions matched Shadow's condition when she arrived. He also found mentions of anonymous tips leading to raids on illegal operations. A few locations caught his attention: abandoned barns and isolated properties not far from his own. Shadow watched him from her spot near the fire, her amber eyes following his every move. Ethan glanced at her, a mix of determination and affection in his gaze. "We're going to make this right," he told her. The following day, Ethan decided to visit one of the locations he'd read about, an old barn a few miles from his cabin that had been raided years ago. Shadow stayed close to him as they walked through the snow-covered property. The barn was dilapidated, its roof partially caved in, but there were signs that it hadn't been entirely abandoned. Fresh tire tracks cut through the snow, leading to a path behind the barn. Ethan's instincts prickled, his hand tightening on the flashlight he carried. "Stay close," he murmured to Shadow. As they followed the tracks, Ethan spotted a makeshift kennel hidden among the trees. His stomach turned at the sight: a few rusty cages, empty food bowls, and chains scattered on the ground. It was clear the place had been used recently, though whoever had been there was long gone. Shadow sniffed the ground, her hackles rising as she let out a low growl. Ethan crouched down, examining one of the chains. It was frayed, its metal stained with rust and something darker. He took a deep breath, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "This is where they kept you, isn't it?" he whispered. Ethan took photos of the site, documenting everything he found. He also collected one of the chains as evidence, wrapping it carefully in a cloth before tucking it into his pack. As they headed back to the truck, Ethan's mind raced. This was more than enough to prove that Travis and his group were involved in something illegal. But it wasn't enough to bring them down completely. He needed more. That night, as Shadow and her pups settled in for the evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, poring over his notes and maps. His determination grew with each piece of the puzzle he uncovered. "Don't worry, girl," he said quietly, glancing at Shadow. "We're going to stop them. For you. For every dog they've hurt." Shadow's gaze met his, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. Ethan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was fighting for something that truly mattered. The days following Ethan's discovery of the hidden kennel were filled with a mix of purpose and vigilance. While Shadow and her pups seemed to be adjusting well to their new life, the tension surrounding the cabin was palpable. Ethan worked tirelessly to strengthen the security of his home, but he also found moments of peace with his new companions. Shadow, once guarded and tense, began to soften around Ethan. She would sit closer to him by the fire, her ears perking up whenever he spoke. Blizzard and Cole, now growing stronger, filled the cabin with their playful antics, tumbling over each other in an endless display of energy. For Ethan, their presence was a balm he hadn't realized he needed. One morning, Ethan decided it was time to give Shadow and her pups a proper outing. The snow had begun to thaw, revealing patches of brown earth beneath the melting frost. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the forest. Shadow followed Ethan eagerly as he stepped outside, her leash loosely wrapped around his wrist. Blizzard and Cole, still clumsy on their tiny legs, waddled after her, their tails wagging furiously. "All right, let's see what you're made of," Ethan said with a chuckle, leading them toward a clearing not far from the cabin. The pups yipped excitedly, chasing after each other as they explored their new surroundings. Shadow, meanwhile, stood at attention, her nose sniffing the air as if scanning for danger. "You don't have to be on guard all the time," Ethan said softly, crouching beside her. "You're safe here." Shadow glanced at him, her amber eyes filled with something that looked like gratitude. As the days turned into weeks, Shadow's transformation became more apparent. Her once matted coat now gleamed with health, and her thin frame had filled out thanks to Ethan's care. Blizzard and Cole grew bolder with each passing day, their personalities shining through. Blizzard was the adventurer, constantly poking his nose into places he shouldn't, while Cole was quieter, preferring to stay close to Shadow or Ethan. Ethan found himself smiling more often, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The cabin, once a place of solitude and sorrow, had become a home brimming with life. One evening, as the pups played by the fire, Ethan sat on the floor with Shadow lying beside him. He reached out to scratch behind her ears, and this time, she leaned into his touch without hesitation. "You're a good girl," he murmured. "A damn good girl." Shadow closed her eyes, a soft sigh escaping her as she rested her head on his knee. Despite the newfound peace, Ethan remained vigilant. He hadn't forgotten Travis's threat or the evidence he'd uncovered at the hidden kennel. Every evening, he checked the locks on the doors and windows, his rifle always within reach. But the days also brought moments of healing. Ethan began venturing into town more often, bringing Shadow and the pups with him. Their presence drew smiles from the locals, who were used to Ethan's solitary demeanor. At the general store, the owner, a kind woman named Marcy, bent down to pet Blizzard and Cole as they waddled around her feet. "You're a long way from the loner we used to know," Marcy said with a grin. Ethan shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Guess I had some good company show up." One afternoon, while chopping wood outside the cabin, Ethan noticed Shadow standing at the window, her nose pressed against the glass. Blizzard and Cole tumbled around her feet, their tiny barks muffled by the cabin walls. Ethan waved at her, and to his surprise, her tail wagged just once, but enough to make his heart swell. When he stepped back inside, Shadow greeted him at the door, her tail wagging slightly as she nudged his hand with her nose. "Well, aren't you full of surprises today?" Ethan said, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. Blizzard and Cole barked happily, circling around his legs in excitement. That evening, as they all sat by the fire, Ethan found himself reflecting on how far they'd come. Shadow, once a terrified and malnourished stray, now exuded strength and trust. Blizzard and Cole, who had been so fragile, were thriving under her care, and Ethan himself had changed. For years, he'd lived in a self-imposed isolation, haunted by the loss of his family, but Shadow and her pups had brought him back to life, giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. "You're not just a dog," Ethan said softly, glancing at Shadow. "You're family." Shadow lifted her head, her amber eyes locking onto his. There was something in her gaze, a quiet understanding, a bond that needed no words. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing her fur. "No one's going to hurt you again, I promise." Shadow leaned into his touch, her body relaxing completely for the first time since she'd arrived. But as the fire crackled and the pups dozed by the hearth, Ethan couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. He knew Travis wouldn't give up easily, and the evidence he'd gathered wasn't enough to dismantle the entire operation. The peace they had found was fragile, and the shadows of the past still lingered. Ethan tightened his grip on the mug of coffee in his hands, staring into the flames. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "we'll face it together." Shadow, as if understanding, shifted closer to him, her head resting on his knee. The night passed peacefully, but both Ethan and Shadow knew the battle wasn't over yet. The night was still, the Montana wilderness blanketed in an eerie quietness that made every sound sharper, every shadow darker. Ethan sat in his armchair by the fire, Shadow resting at his feet. Blizzard and Cole were curled together on a blanket nearby, their tiny bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. Despite the tranquility inside the cabin, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Travis had left too easily the last time. Men like him didn't just give up. They regrouped, plotted, and struck back harder. As the hours passed, Ethan stayed alert, his rifle resting against the wall beside him. Shadow's ears twitched at every creak and groan of the cabin. She was on edge too, her instincts sharp and unwavering. It happened just after midnight. A faint rustling sound came from the tree line. Shadow's head shot up, her body tense as a low growl rumbled in her throat. Ethan straightened in his chair, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. Then came the unmistakable crunch of boots on snow. Ethan stood, moving to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. He saw them, Travis and two other men, creeping toward the cabin under the cover of darkness. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, his grip tightening on the rifle. He turned to Shadow, who was already on her feet, her hackles raised. "Stay with the pups," he said firmly. "I'll handle this." Shadow whined softly, but Ethan's tone left no room for argument. Ethan stepped outside, the icy air biting at his face. He left the door ajar, knowing Shadow wouldn't stay behind if things turned violent. The three men stopped in their tracks when they saw him, their faces partially obscured by scarves and hoods. "That's close enough," Ethan called out, his rifle raised. Travis stepped forward, his hands in the air but his expression smug. "Relax, Harper, we're just here to talk." Ethan snorted. "Funny, last time you showed up, you weren't much for conversation." Travis shrugged, his smirk widening. "Look, I get it. You've grown attached to her, but she's mine. I've got the papers to prove it." "She's not yours," Ethan snapped. "Not anymore, and if you think you can intimidate me into handing her over, you're dead wrong." The man beside Travis chuckled darkly, his hand resting on something hidden beneath his coat. "You sure you want to do this the hard way?" Ethan shifted his stance, his finger brushing the trigger. "Try me." The tension was thick, the cold air buzzing with the threat of violence. Then, without warning, one of the men lunged toward Ethan. Before Ethan could react, a black blur shot past him. Shadow leaped at the attacker, her teeth sinking into his arm. The man screamed, stumbling back as he tried to shake her off. The chaos erupted in an instant. The second man pulled a knife, rushing toward Ethan, but a warning shot from the rifle stopped him in his tracks. "Back off," Ethan barked. Travis cursed, pulling a crowbar from his pack. He moved toward Shadow, who was still grappling with the first man, but Ethan stepped in his path, leveling the rifle at his chest. "You don't want to do that," Ethan growled. For a moment, it seemed like Travis might push his luck, but the look in Ethan's eyes, cold, unwavering, made him think twice. "Call her off," Travis spat, his bravado faltering. Ethan didn't lower the rifle. "You leave now, and maybe I won't let her finish the job." The men hesitated, their confidence crumbling under Ethan's steely gaze and Shadow's relentless assault. Finally, Travis raised his hands in defeat. All right, we're leaving," Ethan whistled sharply, and Shadow released her grip, retreating to his side with a snarl. The man she'd attacked clutched his bleeding arm, glaring at her as he stumbled away. "Next time," Travis growled. "You won't be so lucky." "There won't be a next time," Ethan replied coldly. "If I see any of you near this cabin again, I'll make sure you regret it." Travis and his men retreated into the woods, their threats fading into the darkness. Inside the cabin, Ethan bolted the door and knelt beside Shadow, checking her over for injuries. Her fur was ruffled, and her breathing was heavy, but she was unharmed. "You did good, girl," Ethan said softly, stroking her head. Shadow leaned into him, her tail wagging faintly. Blizzard and Cole, stirred by the commotion, toddled over to nuzzle against Shadow. She licked them gently, her protective instincts still in full force. Ethan sat back against the wall, his rifle resting beside him. The adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "They're not coming back," he said aloud, more to himself than to Shadow. "Not if I can help it." Shadow looked at him, her amber eyes steady and trusting. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he truly had something to protect, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The morning came slowly, the pale sunlight casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Ethan stepped outside, surveying the tree line for any signs of Travis or his men. But the forest was still, and for the first time in days, he felt a fragile sense of peace. Inside, Shadow and her pups were playing by the fire, their soft barks filling the cabin with warmth. Ethan watched them, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're safe now," he said quietly, his voice steady with resolve. "All of you," as the fire crackled and the pups tumbled over each other. Ethan knew the danger wasn't entirely gone, but for now, they had won, and that was enough. The days after the confrontation brought a calmness Ethan hadn't felt in years. The threat of Travis and his men lingered at the edge of his thoughts. But the cabin, for now, felt like a sanctuary. Snow melted steadily, revealing patches of earth and the first signs of spring. It was as if the world itself was thawing, mirroring the changes in Ethan's life. Shadow had fully settled into her role as protector and companion. She no longer flinched when Ethan approached, and her amber eyes carried a softness that had been absent when she first arrived. Blizzard and Cole, now more energetic than ever, explored every corner of the cabin and beyond, their antics drawing laughter from Ethan that he hadn't known he still had in him. One sunny afternoon, Ethan decided to take them all on a proper outing. He packed a small bag with snacks for himself and food for the dogs, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and set out toward the creek a mile from the cabin. The pups bounded ahead, their tiny legs carrying them through the underbrush with surprising agility. Shadow stayed close to Ethan, her pace steady and her gaze vigilant. When they reached the creek, the pups splashed in the shallow water, their high-pitched barks echoing through the forest. Ethan sat on a fallen log, the rifle resting across his knees, watching them with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. "You've got a good life now," he said, glancing at Shadow. She sat beside him, her tail thumping softly against the ground. "All of you." Shadow leaned against him, her warmth a silent affirmation of the bond they had built. Later that evening, as they all returned to the cabin, Ethan noticed a familiar truck parked along the road near his property. His body tensed, but as he approached, he realized it wasn't Travis. Sheriff Halford stepped out, his face grim but his tone warm. "Harper," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Heard you had a bit of trouble out here." Ethan nodded, opening the door for Shadow and the pups to enter the cabin. "Yeah, they came back. We handled it." Halford raised an eyebrow. "Handled it? Huh? You sure they won't try again?" Ethan's gaze hardened. "If they're smart, they'll stay gone." Halford chuckled softly, though his eyes remained serious. "We've been digging into Travis and his crew. Turns out, you were right. They're part of a larger operation. We're moving in on it, but it'll take time to shut it all down." Ethan nodded. "Good. Make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Halford studied him for a moment. "You've done good work here, Harper. Most folks wouldn't have stuck their neck out like you did." Ethan shrugged. "I wasn't about to let them take her." After the sheriff left, Ethan stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Shadow joined him, her amber eyes scanning the tree line. "You're not just a dog," Ethan said softly, scratching behind her ears. "You're family, and family doesn't get left behind." Shadow leaned into his touch, her body completely relaxed. Blizzard and Cole barked playfully from inside, their small figures tumbling over each other near the fire. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's life settled into a new rhythm. The cabin, once a place of isolation and grief, had become a home filled with life and laughter. He spent his days repairing the property, teaching Blizzard and Cole simple commands, and exploring the forest with Shadow at his side. Ethan also began visiting the town more often, volunteering at the local animal shelter. Word of his confrontation with Travis had spread, and people now saw him not as the reclusive loner but as a man who had found purpose again. One day, Marcy, the store owner, handed him a small collar with a tag that read, "Shadow Protector," and smiled. "Every hero deserves recognition," she said. Ethan chuckled, fastening the collar around Shadow's neck. She wagged her tail, her eyes bright with gratitude. The story came full circle one crisp morning as Ethan sat on the porch. A steaming mug of coffee in hand, Blizzard and Cole played in the snow, their happy barks echoing through the quiet forest. Shadow lay at his feet, her head resting on his boot. Ethan stared out at the landscape, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he said quietly, glancing down at Shadow. Her ears perked up, and she looked at him, her gaze filled with a quiet understanding. As the sun rose higher, painting the snow in hues of gold, Ethan smiled. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. And for Shadow, Blizzard, and Cole, the dark days were behind them. Together, they had found what they all needed most: a new beginning.